Aloha and good morning, everyone. My name is Faith Geronimo, CEO of Hawaii Information Service, your MLS provider. Thank you so much for joining us today for Hawaii Real Estate 2020 with Paul Brubaker. Today's webinar is jointly presented by all three of your associations, its boards of directors and executive officers. So thank you so much to Hawaii Island Realtors and Kauai Costa, the West Hawaii Association of Realtors and Karen Shaw, and of course, Karen Ono and the Kauai Board of Realtors. It's been really nice working together to put this event on over the last maybe week and a half, and I hope that this will be the first of many. HIS is always happy and honored to offer support whenever we can, and as the business world especially makes this necessary shift to virtual everything, please know that HIS will always do our best to support this shift and all of you. We remain focused now more than ever on keeping your market moving and working for you. So, please continue to stay safe. So without further ado, I'll turn you over to your virtual stage manager for today, Ryan Ozawa, HIS's Communications Director.
Good morning. Thank you, Faith. And thanks again, yes, to Karen, and Kehao for bringing everyone together. We had over 600 registrants. That's about a third of our combined membership, which I think is a remarkable turnout for any event, virtual or not. And people are still flowing in as I click as fast as I can. Quick reminder at the outset that this is a presentation for the joint memberships of our three boards of realtors. So I know we are joined today by several business partners and affiliates. So if you're new to one of our events, we do ask that you keep that intended audience in mind. We are addressing the specific interests of real estate brokers and agents in our market. So this information isn't really intended for consumers or the public. For the public, we are preparing a press release with key takeaways from this presentation. So if you'd like us to share this with you or to share with your colleagues, you can please let us know. support@hiinfo.com is the email address to get help at any time. This is a Zoom meeting, and as you know, Zoom has been in the news lately for its rapid rise in popularity and for various security and pranking issues. Faith had actually asked me to prepare a guide for everyone, but in the last week, Zoom has released 3 software updates in the last week to address most of those issues. So if you're keeping your software up to date, you are in very good shape. But as with any live event, anything can happen. And for any hiccups with muting or moderating or roosters or leaf blowers, we definitely appreciate your patience. I am still allowing people into the room, and then as quickly as I can, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Paul shortly. If you cannot see his full shared screen, it might be that your window is a little small. You can maximize that window for best results. You can also minimize the participants list, although it is nice to see friendly faces as we go along. Paul's presentation will last about an hour and will followed by about half an hour of Q&A. We got a few questions by email, and if you have questions during the presentation, you can submit them in the chat room. The chat button the chat room can be exposed at the bottom of your screen toward next to the other buttons. Kehao Costa of Hawaii Island Realtors is going to be doing her very best to stay on top of that. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. And if we can't, we'll see if we can provide them to him to address later. So I am now going to mute myself and try to find Paul in the masses of beautiful people. And in just a moment, he will begin his presentation. Thank you again for joining us.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. How many people did we get on here, Ryan?
We are still, I'm standing at the door, brushing folks in. I see, I lost the count, 500 something, I think. Oh, 437.
Awesome. I'm gonna spin wheels here for a second for 2 reasons. One is I haven't had my coffee yet, so gotta get started with that. Second, just to jump to the end, and I'll come back to this point later, a copy of the slideshow has been made available to the Hawaii Island Realtors, the Kauai Board, and the West Hawaii Association of Realtors. And Ryan and the crew over at Hawaii Information Service will have it as well. So you're welcome to get a PDF of that. And the final slide, or penultimate slide, has a list of references that may be of interest that highlight some of the points I'm hoping we'll have time to talk to, but might not to at the end, mostly about the nature of economic recovery from the current event, how you go about structuring the way we do business in the next several months in order to rehabilitate tourism, for one thing, but in the case of real estate, to think about, how technology can be embraced to allow people to maintain a semblance of social distancing and maybe exploit technologies that are actually productivity enhancing and possibly even widen the scope of the potential market. So if I don't get to that, make sure you click on those references. And also, somebody asked me this at the end in the Q&A. I have some notes that I took from a webinar that I attended the other day in my professional association, in which experts in real estate from across the country were engaged in a very lively dialogue. So I'll try to hit a few of those high points, including some observations on commercial real estate. Meanwhile, are we pretty much at full capacity, Brian?
I think we're good to go.
So let me go ahead and begin. Once again, you can get a copy of the PDF of these slides from your affiliated board or association, as well as from your MLS service provider, Hawaii Information Service. I want to say big mahalo to Faith Geronimo and Ryan Ozawa and their whoever the nerds are in the database area that put together some data sets for me at last minute. And everything right now is, we're all working on daily data. So I really appreciate the effort that they made to bring us up to date as much as possible. And on the bottom of each slide is a source reference with links to the underlying data sources if you're interested in pursuing any of those links, or occasionally you'll have a client that's doing their homework and wants to be well informed in their decisions. So I encourage you to take advantage of those resources as well. Well, here we go. I'm going to start with an overview of what we saw on the Big Island and Kauai housing markets. And as you know, remarkably, everything was fine until about 4 weeks ago, and then we just went off the cliff together. And unfortunately, if you're working with monthly data, none of this really shows up unless you're willing to make an estimate, which I have in a couple of cases. But this will at least set the stage, and I think it's important as a reference point when you think about where we end up, because but for the contagion, really nothing fundamentally was wrong with the economy. There were some risks, and we've been tracking the global economic performance, particularly in China, which has had a slowdown the last few years, in emerging markets more generally. Obviously, sort of lingering robustness issues in the European, in the Eurozone, where and Japan, frankly, where the lower bound, the zero lower bound for nominal interest rates, or slightly below that, has persisted all decade. But in the U.S., we had extended the economic expansion by a timely intervention of the Federal Reserve in 2019. You'll recall, following some stock market turbulence at the end of 2018, the so-called Powell put, right? Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell responded with by moving overnight interest rates lower and restoring a bit of that low mortgage interest rate that brought some life back into the housing market. So things were pretty much a momentum story until just March, essentially. And so let's see what that looks like. I'm going to take your MLS data and break it out into 4 moving parts. I segregate the Hilo side of the Big Island from the Kona side. I leave Kauai out. It's actually its own kind of submarket. It's more like Hilo than Kona, but it adds a little bit of noise that if I extract it, it cleans up the Hilo signal. And that's a result of some work that a student at Hilo did many years ago named Onan Masuoka, who later had some success in Major League Baseball, it turns out. But so the Big Island I split up into 3 separate pieces, and then we have Kauai, which we'll see is a lot like Kona in terms of pricing, but a lot like Hilo in terms of volumes. So here are your Hawaii Information Service, MLS service provider data for median single family home prices. I'm just going to stick with single family homes. We'll take a look in did I actually do that? I think I thought about doing that. I'm not sure I have the condos in here now that I recall, but you know, this is the essential barometer for you know, most housing market analytics. And the problem with condos is we get into sort of a resort story that's more challenging to tell unless we have more time, which we're not going to have today. But you can see the path, the stagnation in the 1990s, with which those of us who are around are familiar, and then this really dramatic decade from 1998 to 2008, where offshore investors, particularly in the neighbor island markets from you know, the U.S. Southwest, from California, commingling a demographic factor, which was sort of the boomers reaching their peak earnings, and many of them also having succeeded riding the dot-com bubble or riding the technology wave that came out of the 90s into the early 2000s, an actual surge in U.S. productivity growth at that time, pushing investment at the time at the end of the bubble, the so-called subprime bubble as we know it now. 1/3 of all the, I have that right? 1/3 of all the new homes in Hawaii were being built on the Big Island, which has 1/8 of the state's population. So that's an example of how crazy things got. And of course, you'll recall that on all the neighbor islands, Big Island, Maui, and Kauai, by 2008, the political environment had shifted and people were trying to clamp down on home building at precisely the moment that the recession was going to take care of that anyway. So that compression in value you see in the early 20-teens, you know, from really the peak back in 2005 or 6 to a trough maybe 5 or 6 years later, leads us to this last run, kind of more of an escalator trajectory than the roller coaster we had seen in the prior decade. And I'll close up a little bit here so you can attach some of the numbers to that. Really at the end of this, call it 2011 to 2019, 7 or 8, 9-year run, valuations had only just started to return to the prior peak, although admittedly a bubblicious peak. They were probably a little too high at that moment, but certainly not in the post-financial crisis environment where we got all that stuff fixed up. We got, I think it's fair to say, valuations better rooted in neighbor island and in this case, Big Island economic fundamentals. And there you see the ranked hierarchy where Kona side with a larger offshore investor participation component tends to run at roughly twice the prices that you see on the Hilo side and in Kauai, which are the sort of the last bastion in Hawaii for affordable housing, is, you know, where regular people can actually get an inexpensive house. If you calculate the rates of increase, this escalator to which I referred a second ago, the numbers coming out of the trough, and it was a deeper trough on the neighbor islands than say on Oahu, but no worse than you'll have seen, and certainly not as bad as you saw in markets like Phoenix or Las Vegas after a lot of, you know, Inland Empire, California, South Florida, which during the implosion of the financial crisis, as the subprime bubble burst, saw home values plummet much farther. But coming out of our trough, West Hawaii saw appreciation rates in the 6, 7, 8%, you know, sort of high single-digit rates. And Hilo side was looking at mid-single-digit rates of appreciation. Kauai maybe a little in between there. So 5, 6, or 7% maybe kind of the central tendency of annual home price appreciation right up until the end of 2017, maybe even early 2018. And then, of course, came the East Rift eruption in Lower Puna, and some kind of a speed bump in terms of the speed with which valuations were progressing. But within a year or so, as you got into 2019, and as I mentioned, with the lower interest rates, the lower mortgage interest rates that followed the Fed's pulling back on interest rate normalization in the middle part of the decade, those valuations began to reaccelerate just a little. So you can see the trend. I mean, basically moving along that trend, had we stayed on that path, by 2022 or the end of 2021, we would have been looking at 800,000 median single-family home prices in the, tax map keys 5, 6, 7, and 8, and median prices above 300 in tax map keys 1 through 4, the helocide aggregation. And as I suggested a second ago, it's reasonable to conject that, should economic fundamentals essentially restore themselves somewhere down the road after we've managed through the coronavirus event, those still could be useful benchmarks. Whether there'll be an overshoot, as you've seen in the stock market, obviously, or say in oil prices, remains to be seen. I think there's probably going to be some compression. But as I say, if you're willing to bet, as many people are, that whatever made the neighbor islands attractive will continue to be factors influencing investor decisions going out into the 2020s, then there's no reason to believe a path like this couldn't be restored. Although sometimes you see these paths displaced, right? The appreciation stays the same, but the path gets knocked off, and that's what happened in the last cycle. If you look at sales volumes, I've pushed all these data together, but the scales I've organized so that they're equiproportionate. So the scale on the right, which is Hilo and Kona sales volumes, runs from 50 to 500, and the scale on the left, which is the Kauai data set, runs from 7 to 70. So they each represent tenfold increases in logarithmic scales. So slopes are percent changes. So you see that long run from the 90s through the peak of the housing bubble in 2005 in terms of transactions volumes, and then again the displacement and then restoration of a slightly slower growth trajectory in the 20 teens, running right up to the present, of course, taking into account the disruption represented by the volcanic eruption, and to some extent also by the fact that interest rates had been rising and then were pulled back in the course of 2019. And here we were sort of, good to go for 2020. And then this happened. Here are the Kauai sales data to compare with those Big Island numbers we were just looking at. Same kind of path, a nice long ascent out of the 90s into the peak of the housing bubble. And then after that path shift, return to sales volume growth at a slightly slower rate of increase, a slightly flatter path in the 20 teens, culminating now, and you can see maybe some of those COVID-19 data starting to show up in Kauai transactions. These are all, we've been looking at quarterly data, so the last data point is the first quarter of this year. And I'll also highlight from these Kauai data the role of black swan shocks in sales volume. So I've highlighted 3 here: the 9/11 event, the Lehman Brothers event, and the what I think may be attributable to or associated with the global equity market meltdown in the 4th quarter of 2018. You may recall that China equity valuations, because of Trump's trade war, China equity valuations had been eroding throughout the course of 2018. And as the Trump administration dialed up the tariffs and the tit for tat tariff policy responses from around the globe, because we're putting tariffs on everybody, as those progressed in the course of 2018, stock markets became increasingly concerned about the consequence of what is bad trade policy. And in the 4th quarter of 2018, there was a massive meltdown in stock market valuations, which, as I suggested earlier, led the Fed to intervene right before Christmas, initially by changing the language, their communication strategy changed, and then in the course of 2019, lowering interest rates. But that that wealth compression you saw in stocks, and then after the Lehman moment, again, associated with a meltdown in equity valuations. And of course, after 9/11, these kinds of events are worth remembering as having been there all along, maybe not or never as big as the one we're experiencing right now. But you know, when things go back to normal, normal will still have these shocks latent in the paths that we're following. Turning to Kauai single-family median home prices, I did want to take advantage of that data set, as I have in the Big Island data set in the past. At certain times, we talked about this both places. That so the median price is a measure of the central tendency of the distribution of home prices, right? Where, you know, where's the middle? The median is where half of the prices are above and half are below. The mean, the so-called the arithmetic mean, the average, is the first moment of the distribution of home prices. You remember your statistics, and if prices were distributed like in you know, a human height, so if it adhered to a bell-shaped curve kind of configuration, then the mean and the median would be the same. The midpoint would be the same no matter how you measure it. But because home prices are skewed, there's lots of transactions with low prices and not so many at high prices. That skewness leads the median and the mean to depart. And just as we can calculate the first moment, the mean, we can calculate higher order moments, measures of dispersion like standard deviation, skewness, which is the third moment. And what I'm showing here is the fourth moment of the distribution, kurtosis, along with the median, to illustrate an interesting point that's come up in the past when we've talked with all of you guys about your markets. Kurtosis is an indication of how many transactions there are way out at the tail, at the end of the tail, like Mark Zuckerberg's house. You know what I mean? Like way out at the end of the tail. In fact, I exclude Mark Zuckerberg's house from the transaction data. It's ridiculous. You can't, that's not normal. So it's not usual. So I just take it out. And what you see with kurtosis is that when there's a lot of transactions up in that high tail, it's usually at a moment where the investors are starting to show up and the feeding frenzy is about to begin and prices generally are about to take off. Now they take off because under such circumstances, housing demand, as it swells, tends to outstrip housing supply, the ability of builders to produce new houses or the willingness of existing homeowners to sell their houses and depart. And that stickiness on the supply side, that lack of elasticity, so to speak, where rising prices signal to a builder build more houses, typically because it's jammed up by regulatory barriers and whatnot, geographic constraints. That stickiness on the supply side when demand is about to surge leads prices to accelerate, as you see in that famous subprime bubble of the early 2000s. Now, the kurtosis jump at the end of the 90s that was a precursor to the bubblicious surge in median prices in the subsequent decade was an extraordinary event. There was an extraordinary stock market bubble in the 90s, an extraordinary amount of wealth created in California. All the dot-com refugees decided to buy a house in Kauai or something, or that whole story. In the 20 teens, we saw something of a much more moderate order of magnitude in both dimensions. So you can see once the recession was over and valuations had settled and found their bottom for the cycle, that escalator started up again around 2011 or so, where I've marked there at the price point 445. Yeah. Once that escalator started, you saw a modest surge in transactions at the tail of the distribution. And here I've excluded Mark Zuckerberg's transaction, but there were others buying at the high end that briefly pulled out the tail and kind of dragged along the distribution of home prices. But in this case, in the 20 teens, with much less bubblicious consequence. If you look very carefully at that regression, you see just the slightest arc from 445 going above that trend and then settling back to the first quarter number 744 for the median single family home price, which I calculate, by the way. That may not be the official statistic. These are seasonally adjusted data, by the way. All the data have been seasonally adjusted here. So, you know, that little tiny surge over the trend is all we got, is all the bubble there was in the 20 teens. But again, you can look for some of these telltale signs, and I'd be looking, you know, as we come through this and go out into the rest of the 2020s and think about where we end up as an economy, as a regional economy, you might be looking for, you know, what happens at the high end. If people abandon high-end investing in Hawaii, I would say, you know, be prepared for it. On the other hand, maybe we put in place protocols which make it, we put in place protocols more rapidly than other jurisdictions or economies that help build a reputation for being either coronavirus safe or coronavirus free, or having stronger mitigation than elsewhere, and actually create for Hawaii a more attractive reputation as either a travel destination or an investor, as a host for offshore investment. So to be seen, and of course, what I just suggested requires some work. I'll close up a little bit on that Kauai median single family home price series to just make this point that Kauai valuations have been rising about 5 or 6% this decade. So again, you get this pattern, Kona, Hilo, Kauai, all sort of in a range from 5 to 7% appreciation once the stabilization in the early 20 teens had been concluded about 2011. And we were good to go. And the question now becomes, of course, how big is this speed bump we're looking at, and where do we end up if we are able to cross the chasm that's opening up in front of us and we're sort of all falling into at the same time. I talked about the home price distributions, and I just want to make clear that it's possible, because of the way I carved up the data, to calculate all of them. Sorry, Kau, I've left Kau out. There's not enough data really to do a proper job of this. But for Big Island as a whole, in the upper left, you can see the home price distribution. Compare that to Kauai, you would say, well, sort of on average, or the bulk of the distribution of home prices on the Big Island is in lower price ranges, right? The horizontal axis is in thousands of dollars, so 500,000, a million, 1.5, so on and so forth. And I've cut off all the distributions at 2.5 million. And by the way, these all run out to 20 or 25 million at the tail end of the distribution. And for the Kona data set, by the way, I've actually excluded 5 transactions. You can see in the footnote, I cut out everything over 10 million. And then the graph itself is cut off at 2.5 million. But most of us are peasants. We live in a house that's worth less than 2.5 million. And you can see these distributions. The Hawaii County overall distribution is lower because Hilo is more affordable. And then on the right panels of this graphic, you can see that Kona and Kauai are very similar in terms of their pricing structure and median prices. Whereas, as I mentioned at the outset of this section, Kauai transactions volumes are very much like Hilo transactions volumes. I think that's right. My screen is blocked by something here. Let's see. Yes, correct. You are correct, sir. So I think that's about it for the housing discussion. As I say, literally, and we were looking at data right through March 30th. So these are the data sets through 1 week ago. But we all know what's happened in the last 3 or 4 weeks. And we're all in the same barrel going off Niagara Falls together. And so the question becomes, what's going to happen in the short run? What could we think about in terms of a long run equilibrium? And how do we get from here to there? How do we get from this free fall to that point down the road where things get back to maybe a new normal? And that's what we'll spend the rest of the time talking about here. So let's take a look at some of those coronavirus data. Here are the cumulative daily confirmed COVID-19 cases published by the Hawaii Department of Health. And by the way, just on the record, dudes, could you please post a spreadsheet? You seriously expect us to go to your website every day and download the data every day? Dude, I mean, what? Okay, so I've written to them. Nobody's responded. These are the data. I have the data every day. I go up there and pull down the new data, or my student intern, thank you, Sierra Brewer is her name, from Maryknoll High School. But these are the data, and you can see the arc. People talk about bending the curve or flattening the curve. You can see that it looks like we might be achieving that. And actually, the curve you see there, which has the case count stabilizing by the end of this month, is the actual estimate that I get from the data we have. Of course, it's contingent on my model being right, and what are the odds of that? So a little light at the end of the tunnel, perhaps we are bending that curve. If you compare where we are right now, and by the way, this is how old, this is ancient, this is 2 days old. So 435 is the count, and in a half hour, they're gonna post a new one. 388 was the count on Monday. I just wanna illustrate, you know, the first success we had was in formalizing social distancing here in Hawaii around the 3rd week of March. And that's when we all kind of agreed, okay, fine, we're gonna work from home, wear masks, stand 6 feet away from each other, do that whole thing, stop buying toilet paper. You can see how the case count through March 23rd or 24th had actually been exponentiating, right? This is what happens when a contagion is not managed, is not mitigated. Like we missed the boat on containment. We failed to contain the virus. So now we're in mitigation. And what you're trying to do in mitigation is to keep the thing from curving upward and killing everybody. And we managed to get a good start on that here in Hawaii in the 3rd week of March. And now we're seeing further progress. So, you know, congratulations, but don't let down your guard. As a consequence, the numbers of daily new cases in Hawaii, which is what you're looking at in this slide, slide 14, is starting to bend over the top. Now, I don't know if my model is correct. Almost certainly it's not. But when I actually fit the data to this particular mathematical structure, I get that curvature. So it's not too early to start to think about what happens when we get through the month. Let's say we're successful, get through the month, and enter May and want to sort of get back to work and get back in business. We have to start talking about how we do that prudently so that we don't reignite the contagion down the road. And we'll come back to some of that discussion later. Some of the lessons we could learn about how you do that, some of the best lessons are coming from East Asia. So we were just looking at the Hawaii case data. Here are the Taiwan daily case counts. And guess what? Hawaii has more COVID-19 cases than Taiwan. Hawaii, with 1.4 million people, has more cases than Taiwan with 23 million people. I looked it up. I thought it was 30 something, but it's 23, 24 million. So whatever they're doing, we should probably learn from at least some of it. And again, we'll come back to that in just a second. If you look at the cumulative case counts, you can compare Hawaii and Taiwan. You see exactly what I'm talking about. Taiwan had early entry of the coronavirus into the country and jumped on it right away with testing and tracing protocols, and taking people's temperatures before they went into the building, and deploying masks and all of that stuff, and social distancing, of course. And then in the middle of March, what happened? So they were, moderately successful at containment and seemed to be mitigating relatively well until the middle of March. And then what happened? All of the people, all the Taiwanese expats who had been studying in North America or studying in Europe or whatever, working abroad, they came home and they brought the coronavirus home with them from Europe and North America. So that's when Taiwan's case count accelerated just a week ahead of Hawaii's. But of course, by then they developed this architecture for mitigation that's really paid off for them, and they're bending that curve much faster. So again, a lesson to learn from Asia. You've all heard the stories from South Korea, which of course had these massive breakouts in mid-February, and but again, serves as an example of how to bend that curve and knock down the acceleration of viral contagion and get it into a containment mode where you begin to have the ability to think about how you reset economic activity, how you reboot the economy. In terms of testing, I'm sorry, this is case incidence, so the number of cases per 1,000 persons. Korea, as is true elsewhere in East Asia, in Singapore and Thailand, sorry, Taiwan, as well as South Korea, and to some extent Japan, have had much more success. Again, if you normalize, if you divide by the population. And Hawaii also has much more success than the US as a whole, where it's just cray-cray. So yeah, forget about whatever they're saying on the East Coast. Let's do what the crazy rich Asians are doing. You've probably seen some of these data. In the early weeks of testing, the US was in last place. South Korea was way ahead of the US. So, you know, there's just so much evidence that extensive testing, these tracing technologies where you look into people's social networks and identify where risks exist using smartphone apps and geo-positioning, GPS and geofencing and whatnot are really the techniques to adopt. And of course, that first wave in China has now, of coronavirus infections, has now been tamped down there, and North America and Europe, I'm sorry, the Americas generally, North and South America and Europe currently represent the second wave, which just these last couple weeks, these are daily data, just the last week, maybe two, but you know, the last week, the data have started to bend. So let's keep on doing it. These are testing data for the US, and you can really see where, you know, one of the obvious policy failures were in America, that we relied on an agency that does great things for us, the Centers for Disease Control, but for whatever reason was a little flat-footed at the start of this, had these protocols where I remember sitting in a meeting with Dr. Desmond, the state of Hawaii's testing lab guy, and this was a meeting on Friday, March 6th. I was sitting across the table from him, and we were like, so what's up with testing? And he said, well, we didn't start testing till Wednesday. And we were like, say what? You know, they didn't start testing in Hawaii till March 4th. And we were like, well, why? They said, well, we were following the CDC protocol. And we all were like, shut the F up. Hey, stop listening to those guys. Let's do what Singapore is doing. So anyway, we've gotten on board, and so have public health laboratories across the country. And you can really see the big difference in these data in March, once the public health labs jumped on board, and of course, you know, at the state level and in local, you know, municipalities and whatnot, and of course, as private testing came along, the real, you know, the high throughput automated testing we're now seeing, and there's this new point of care device that Abbott Labs has developed, where you walk into the urgent care, they test you. 5 minutes later, they can tell you if you're sick. 15 minutes later, they can tell you you're not sick. So we got to keep pushing on that. The state also publishes some testing data and some incidence data, State of Hawaii Department of Health. And again, please post the spreadsheet, yo. You can't expect us to go up there every day and download one data point. So there's the links on the bottom. You know, write your legislator and have them put the pressure. I know they're all busy, but I mean, just post the spreadsheet. So these are the actual graphics from the Department of Health website. I just copied them, and then I put my own what you call axes labels and stuff, because theirs were lame. You can see how much the testing has ramped up here in Hawaii on the right side of the panel. Although I don't like that it's slowing down, let's just keep ramping. And how many more negative tests, of course, are coming in now. And on the on the left side of the screen, you can see the age distribution of incidence of positive tests. So it is definitely, a condition that's affecting older people. I'll tell you what, 80% of the cases, this is something the state has noted, in Hawaii, 80% of the cases are basically old buggers coming back from Las Vegas or Seattle or something. I mean, 80% of the cases in Hawaii are returning residents who brought the coronavirus back with them from mostly from the mainland. So we're, aside from those individuals, and whose cases are not being handled, and that's partly why you see, it's who travels to the mainland in the winter, older people going to Vegas or where visiting family and so on. So now that we know that, we can be reassured that maybe community spread is not quite as extensive, and more important, that we have the ability to manage community spread by continued adherence to social distancing protocols, wearing masks, washing your hands, cleaning surfaces, all that good stuff that we really began engaging in about a month ago. It's starting to pay off, and we should continue. The problem, of course, with the way the mortality associated with the coronavirus plays out is that it really hits the elderly hard, the elderly and people with pre-existing conditions. And these are just some preliminary data. These, at the time I copied the data, they hadn't been published yet, but some early data from the Chinese experience about what proportion of persons at different age cohorts end up dying as a consequence of their infection, and much higher in persons over 80 or in their 60s and 70s. So be kind to us old guys. Okay, let's move forward and think about how this is playing out in the economy. Well, thanks to Hawaii Information Service, I made this special request. I said, can you guys give me listings? I want listings. And sure enough, just as I thought, this is really pertinent to your industry. So here, what they gave me daily new home listings for Big Island and Kauai. I've combined the data sets, and you can see for the first 8 to 10 weeks of the year, so I converted them to weekly data, and you can see how stable the trajectory was. A very stable path, a slight upward trajectory in new listings through January, coming into February, and even in the first week or two of March, and then bam, the thing hit. We call this a sudden stop in economics, and you can see the weekly listings just fall off the cliff. At this point, as of a week ago, they were falling at about a 40 or 50% rate, and we'll look at some other data that are worse. But here it is, you guys. Now, the question everybody's asking, is it going to be V-shaped? Is it going to be U-shaped? Is it going to be L-shaped? And to anticipate where I'll end up in the conclusion, it can be V-shaped if we make it V-shaped. That's kind of the answer. Is how aggressively we mitigate can have a big impact. And a second but really important point, how you change the way you do business will have a really big impact. And we'll talk a little more about that in a second. But now that we're all working at home, if you weren't before, you're probably realizing that something like this, doing something online, may be a more productive way to do it anyway. Let's just look at some other data. Here I've mapped those same listings data. You can see the drop in listings with the Hawaii case count. So you can really see the listings drop off as soon as the coronavirus cases begin to ramp up. Now, I've also indicated here, as you can see, that in the model that I developed, and I would not trust my model to be predictive, but it's kind of interesting how close it is. I'm just saying, if we're successful at curving that back down, this question I alluded to earlier naturally arises. What happens if a month from now we get the daily case count down to single digits, and we're sort of, every time there's a case, we jump on it, we get the tracing in place, we get the isolation and quarantine in place. How do we go back to business in an environment in which we're managing that case count until the day that comes, which will come maybe in a year, more likely 18 months, hopefully not 2 years, the day at which a version of herd immunity or vaccination become available? I mean, that's going to happen. So the question is, how do we get from May 2020 to, say, March through September 2021? I mean, that would be sort of how do you operate for a year with protocols in place that mitigate the spread of the coronavirus and yet allow you to get back to business and take advantage of low interest rates and maybe find a bargain somewhere along the way, or make that move you were always thinking about doing, but you've been putting off. And now the coronavirus has put everything in a new perspective, and you're going to change your life. I'm just saying we all have to figure out how to get back to business. The impact on employment, as we all know, and there's a new US employment data set that came out this morning, not enough time to put it into the slideshow, that shows the jump. This is the jump in Hawaii claims for unemployment insurance. Literally the last 2 weeks, and of course we're going to have a new weekly data point now in a couple days. So, I mean, that's a sudden stop. Here are the passenger counts. And so I've got a smooth, I think it's a 7-day average. I got this from UHERO. They use a smoothing algorithm to take, noisy daily data and smooth it out. And you can see the seasonal bumps, Christmas vacation, President's Day. And then last year, the 2019 time series, there's spring break. And this year, the cliff as we go to a virtual shutdown of air passenger. And again, raise the question, how do we restore air transportation? Because this is how we roll in Hawaii. We don't roll, we fly. So we'll come back to that later. Here are the visitor counts. What I've done is I've taken the daily passenger counts through April 7th and April 8th for international. And I've assumed that the visitor counts replicate what the passenger counts are doing. And there you go. So there's never been anything like this. Actually, technically there was, remember the 3 days after 9/11? So these are monthly data. And for the 3 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday, I think if I recall correctly, Friday, the international flights first came back, and then Saturday, the domestic flights first came back. It's a little vague now. It's been 20 years. But so technically after 9/11, we did see this on a daily basis. It lasted for not quite a week. And then, of course, we went back. And to be sure, it's possible that by the end of April, we may be seeing, more than zero visitor counts. But the question is, how do we do that without opening up the risk of further exposure, as we've seen in places that have really successfully managed, like Taiwan or Singapore, where after initial successes in mitigation and containment, they actually saw case counts increase as returning residents came back from Europe and North America. That's what we have to avoid. That's why we have to learn from those experiences. And looking at these tourism data, I mean, a month ago, we had the luxury of having these kind of interesting discussions about what would we do if we didn't have tourism. Okay, now, not interested at all in that conversation. Shut the hell up. This is what it's like without tourism, okay? So let's just not go there again. The question is, how do we manage tourism when we bring it back? Because it was relatively unmanaged. And maybe this will come up at the end. I have some ideas about that. Anything you do to manage visitor arrivals can be used to manage visitor behavior once they're here. In fact, it's not just visitors, it's local guys going around ripping up the trails or whatever, right? So what everybody was calling over-tourism management problems were actually just management problems. They were just natural resource management problems, congestion, all that other stuff. So we'll maybe come back to this in the discussion. Here, of course, is the epic stock market beatdown of the last several weeks. And I just remind you that the stock market over the last year or two, since the Trump trade war, has been actually going through a series of beatdowns because of the stupid trade war. So, we were knocked off the path by the trade war, set up like a bowling pin, as it were, for an event like this. And who could predict? Okay, everybody predicted that something like this would happen. And here's the point about black swans. They're going to happen. There's going to be a volcanic eruption on the Big Island. There's going to be a hurricane if you sit in the intertropical convergence at 20 degrees north latitude, right? You just don't know when, and you don't know how big it's going to be, and you don't know how long. it's going to impair your economic activity. But you know, Garance Bombarance, there's going to be, Kilauea is going to erupt, there's going to be a hurricane, and there's going to be another biological event or geopolitical event or whatever. So no act. You can see the market has been encouraged. The stock market participants have been encouraged by dramatic, if not fully defined, fiscal policy response, fiscal policy interventions to provide some stabilization for aggregate demand, which has shriveled up because we're all sitting at home instead of shopping and going out to eat. And you can see how the market perceives the monetary, extremely aggressive monetary policy response, running the overnight rate to the zero bound and putting QE on steroids. I mean, this is QE to the nth power, what the Fed is, and Jay Powell was talking about something this morning. I didn't have time to listen to him either, but right after this, I'm going to go listen to his podcast because policymakers around the world are really pulling out the stops to stabilize the economy. And again, the whole point here is to make this as V-shaped as possible. Now, there's an old rule of thumb in the stock market, by the way, don't buy the first bounce. So we'll see how that plays out. But right now, the S&P 500 is looking pretty good. I'll point out that there are other parts of the economy on which we had felt a little bit more reassured, about which I'm a little bit more concerned right now. A colleague of mine who's the chief economist for the Associated General Contractors did a survey nationwide of contractors and found that many of them were reporting various supply chain disruptions and or delays or investor pullbacks that were of concern. A few weeks ago, we thought that construction might actually be as an essential sector or whatever we're calling them, something that sort of continue. I go to work, I climb up the ladder to my crane on the 30th floor, and I sit there by myself and I'm socially distanced. But again, we're seeing some supply chain issues, and then there are some investor uncertainties, obviously, and then further down the road, the question is going to be, will the demand be there for whatever I'm building? So we're starting to see previously resilient, parts of the economy that we previously thought were relatively resilient coming under some pressure. And this is hilarious. This is the National Association for Business Economics, which I'm a member. So tells you how much you should listen to us guys. This is the survey of members about the probability of recession. And you remember last year and the year before, there was a lot of talk about the risk of recession, and the Fed acted last year to try to, preempt that risk and push the risk of recession out into the future. And literally in the February 2020 survey, you see the dark bars there, the perception was that the recession risk for this year, which previously had been thought was higher, had begun to recede, no pun intended, had begun to move out into the future. And people are thinking, well, the recession risk is really out in 2021, 2022. We're good to go for 2020. And then 1 month later, boom. So that's how fast these things happen. There's the Fed's intervention. This is the Treasury yield curve. Everything is basically 0 to 1%, right? The overnight rate's at 0. The 10-year yield's at 0.7, 0.75. And so the mortgage interest rates are down to, sub 3.5%. So look, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Don't leave 3.5% money lying on the table. At least see if it's worth doing a refi. But I think we should all be, looking through the abyss, over the abyss, through the black hole to the other end of this. And, housing is a long-term investment, thinking about at what point do we pull the trigger, at what point, don't be premature in making, don't make a hasty investment decision, but think about what's going on and do your homework and make an informed decision. Finally, let's just take a few lessons from history, and I'll wrap up here in a second. You're welcome to go back and look at these data sets. I was actually a history major at Stanford when I was an undergraduate. And then I realized I better take some math and economics so I could get a job. But my favorite course as an undergraduate was a course called Chaucer's England, which was uh, co-listed in the English department, medieval literature, and the history department. So cross-listed in history and English. And we would go to my professor's house once a week, Monday evening or something, and we would read Chaucer in Middle English. Like first we had to learn Middle English, how to pronounce it, and then we would read. And that was when I really got my introduction to the Black Death of 1348, which wiped out a third of Europe's population, plus or minus, and had globally catastrophic consequences. That's without airplanes. A century ago, the world went through another one of these pandemics, and with a viral origin, the so-called Spanish flu. And this one actually had a big impact on my life because my grandfather was drafted in March of 1918, went off to fight in World War I, was wounded in September, spent 9 months in a hospital in France, and then later New York and Chicago. And when he came home in June of 1919 to resume his junior year in college at University of Illinois, he came home to find that his oldest brother had died in the flu pandemic. And the flu pandemic killed more American Expeditionary Force military personnel than battle. Slight majority of all fallen Americans in World War I died of disease. And that really made an impact because, we always wanted my grandfather to tell us the stories of the war. And he would only tell us that the thing that he took away as a wounded vet was not the battle scars, but this experience of coming home and finding his oldest brother had passed in the interim. So here's some indications of how business activity responded at that time. I have no reason to believe this is going to be any different. It might be sharper and more severe instantaneously because we embraced social distancing so aggressively, right? We had to sort of turn off the light switch on the economy. And I want to also make this point that black swans, as I suggested earlier, the whole thing about black swan risk is that the fact that you don't know when one of these things is going to happen leads people to become complacent about the possibility it might happen. So you sort of forget from hurricane to hurricane, that you probably should have a stockpile of bottled water so that you all don't have to go down to Costco on the same day and load up on it. I'm just saying, here are the visitor counts for Hawaii from the 1920s and 30s. And you can see very much like we see today, the Roaring '20s was a period of tourism growth. And then the Great Depression was a period of tourism decline. And then in the 1930s, right before passenger aviation, commercial passenger aviation was unleashed, Hawaii went through an extreme event where maritime strikes on the US West Coast shut down, right? The original sort of we have no toilet paper event. So I'm just saying, we can go through history and find these events. These are the 9/11 data for domestic arrivals. And you tell me, is that V-shaped? Is that a Nike swoosh? Right, that's what people are talking about. These are the visitor counts for Oahu and the neighbor island after 9/11, the international counts. Here are the SARS data, and I put all the data up there to annoy you, right? You can estimate how big a hit, how long it took. Now, these are smaller than the current one, at least instantaneously. But again, if we do this right, we shut down instantaneously, we put in the protocols to manage tourism once people come back, then we should be able to turn on the switch again. And if, having done so, we successfully establish Hawaii as a destination that's a safe destination. I mean, right now, which countries would you travel to? Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, the United States, Italy, or Spain? I'm just saying. So, and then finally here are, these are general fund tax revenues for the state. The state's going to face some severe compression. And by the way, the Fed announced a facility this morning where, in addition to expanding the scope of its asset purchases to include municipal securities and corporate securities of a lower credit quality, I think a facility is being set up with the U.S. Treasury so that the Fed can actually purchase, state general obligation bonds and whatnot to help state and local governments bridge their way through the crisis. So, I mean, everybody's pulling out all the spots. I'll just conclude with, I'm just going to pound on this point one more time about black swans. Here's the conditional volatility of the S&P 500 on a daily basis at annual rates. So 1.0, that would be 100% volatility. So you'd say, my forecast for the growth of the S&P 500 is 7% plus or minus 100%, right? That's what that COVID-19 number would say. And I'm just trying to make the point here, these things do come and go. We get over them. The biological events are, this biological event, of course, is like nothing we've seen for a century, but there have been other ones, and you can see that in the tourism data. So these are the conditional volatility estimates for monthly Hawaii visitor arrivals on an annualized, I'm sorry, that's supposed to say conditional annualized monthly volatility, my bad. That's monthly, not daily. But again, the same kind of profile. And yes, COVID-19 is the big dog, at least for the 50 years that we've been measuring the data. But you can see that the biological events, SARS in 2003, the avian flu, or bird flu was it, in 2009, and then the swine flu, or did I get those backwards? Just a couple of years ago, the fifth wave of the H7, H9, they have had impacts through tourism, just nothing quite as extreme involving a shutdown. And even 9/11, which did involve a shutdown for 3-4 days and better part of a week or two, eventually, you know, we recovered from. So again, how we do it matters. I encourage you to get yourself educated. There's a lot of fascinating stuff that's out there, both in visual media as well as tremendous papers. I highly recommend 2 papers currently posted on the UHERO website, the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization, that talk about what mechanisms have to be put into place to get the Hawaii economy back on track, because Hawaii is unique as an island economy, as a remote island economy, in the same way, say, that Taiwan is, where you can't drive to the next county. And finally, just at the bottom, a few examples of some of these technology-oriented interventions that other countries are trying, involving smartphone technology, GPS tracking, and whatnot. So I'll stop there, and we can switch to the Q&A. I think that was about an hour exactly. Ryan?
Yes, we will have the effervescent Kehao handle the Q&A.
That sounds like Alka-Seltzer.
Ah, the brilliant Kehao.
Okay, so I don't know how you best want me to, you all right, Paul?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm turning down my volume.
Sorry.
Your mic works better than mine.
I'm screaming in your ear.
No.
Okay, so I've logged everybody's questions that came in through the chat.
Yeah.
I don't know what would be best, if you would like me to share my screen so you can kind of read along.
Kehao, what I suggest is, because you can do some consolidation maybe, can you sort of organize and just read a version of, or the most important verbatim part of the questions, and then I'll answer it that way.
Yeah, okay, so because I was paying attention to the chat, I'm sure you answered some of these questions along
That's
the
okay.
way.
And actually, we did have some on, by the way, Ryan, I will stop sharing right now. Is that okay?
Sure. We can just see your beautiful face, Paul.
Or go to, yes, okay. So shall I look at some of those questions I got earlier, or do you want to start with
those are the top 3 that I have, the 3 that came in by email.
Okay,
so,
yeah, why don't you start there and I'll keep track on my phone.
Okay, so one of the questions was, some people think we will have a hockey stick recovery.
Yes.
Can you also discuss how a years-long recession will affect the real estate market on Hawaii Island?
So the first caveat about any of this is, how the hell do I know? I mean, seriously, if you say you're doing forecasting right now, yeah, you're not, trust me. everything's happened so quickly and so intensely that, and as I've suggested, it raises the possibility that maybe the intensity itself will actually diminish, and we could get back to something that might be a newer normal. That's my hope. And as I indicated a couple times, and I suggested in terms of the readings that I listed links to, particularly the readings, how you do it matters. My own opinion is that the impression is that the state is not leading as much as following, and not following fast enough. So and people in industry. So I've had this conversation on email with airline people as well. And I'm like, dude, Google's already tracking my phone. Facebook tracks your phone if you're not a Facebook user. So why would the Department of Health? I'm just saying right now, that technology is probably the way we get to a position where we can restore economic activity for a period. Now, you may want to turn off that technology once there's a vaccine. You see what I mean? Or you may get to a point where there's sufficient herd immunity prior to the introduction of a vaccine. So anyway, how you forecast the real estate market has a lot to do with what we put in place in the next couple months. The hockey stick, or I've heard it called a Nike swoosh, and I used to call it the reverse J, where you go down and then you come back, but not as all the way back to where you were at the beginning. All of those seem like plausible paths. So it's never fully V-shaped, and it's never square U-shaped, although the SARS episode was. And the lesson from SARS is, once the containment is in place, right, there's still no vaccine for SARS, is there? I haven't heard of one. But if you can get containment and mitigation to succeed, it's possible to actually, for the old normal to be the new normal. I don't think that's the case this year for a variety of reasons. This virus is way more efficient at transmitting itself, and lurks in about, I don't know, 10 to 20, maybe a larger proportion of the population, asymptomatically or pre-symptomatically. So for all those reasons, what I would say is I would expect a pullback in sales volume, and I would expect some compression in valuations. I mean, some people have to do a trade. They have to move, or what changes in family status, or death in the family. They have to take care of their parents on the mainland, or vice versa. The kids decide not to go back to college because there is no college, so you need a bigger house because you're driving each other crazy, sheltering in place. I mean, for all those reasons, I can come up with scenarios where transactions volumes, sorry, I just dropped my notes, could be restored. And I just want to read to you some of the examples I got from a webinar on the impacts of COVID-19 on real estate markets, just comments that are relevant to this question. These were the opinions of 4 economists, the chief economist from the Mortgage Bankers Association, Mike Fratantoni, chief economist from House Inc., Ralph McLaughlin. These are the new companies that co-invest in home buying. Frank Nothaff, the chief economist from CoreLogic, Skylar Olson from Zillow, senior principal economist from Zillow. And here were 3 or 4 key points. Number 1, a movement towards fully electronic closing and remote notarization, fully digital mortgages. This episode has vastly accelerated movement to e-signatures on all electronic documents. I have a question for you guys. I wouldn't know the answer to this question, but think about, I mean, it's rhetorical, but does Hawaii have RON, remote online notarization, enabling fully electronic closing with third-party authentication? Okay, we should.
We do.
We do, awesome.
I've heard a little bit about that, and if anybody can chat in the chat box, but I think that we are doing that locally, but not with mainland.
So that first point, we move towards algorithmic, right? A majority of mortgages originated in America today are done algorithmically by bots, not by humans. the nation's largest mortgage lender is Quicken, okay, not a bank. Second, working remotely may shift housing preferences towards more rural, less urbanized areas, and some spatial dispersion of housing demand is possible. Third, virtual open houses are extremely promising. Agents will move in this direction for listing and marketing, and it will move down from a high, it is mostly concentrated in a high-end market, and maybe move to the middle. Virtual walkthroughs in the last month led to a 300%, you thought the increase in the demand for toilet paper what's the one, Clorox cleanup was high. The demand for creation of 3D home virtual walkthroughs increased 300% last week nationwide. It lowers the cost of getting it done, and now that everybody is doing it, what was once a niche product is now becoming the norm. And finally, just go back and think about the natural disaster literature in general. Do people want to live on the coast after a hurricane, right? Do people want to live in Lower Puna after the last volcanic eruption? The long-term dynamics are the same, long-term dynamics of prices and sales volumes and whatnot. And risks were, most risks were already priced in, but people changed their risk calculus, their perception of risk in response to events such as the one we're now going through. So, I don't know the answer. My guess is there's going to be some compression in both volumes and values, and we'll be wanting to track the HIS data carefully to see evidence of that. But again, where I started, I think I'm not incorrect. The path we were on was probably the right path. There's this big gap in between, where we just left off and where I hope we'll be. There may be displacement. I'll get my hands right. There may be displacement, and we saw that after the Great Recession. But that was a financial dislocation of a sort that we're not experiencing right now. So if we can get the protocols in place, maybe we can just return to the pre-existing path.
Okay, there's another question. Once we get back to normal, do you anticipate price levels pushing upward? I think you just kind of answered that a little bit with compression of value and maybe some.
Yeah. The one other caveat I would say, it's important to remember. So now it's 2020. We're looking at the lost summer or the lost year or whatever, and then I'm conjecturing that by 2021, by the end of 2021, there'll be a vaccine. By the beginning of 2021, if we're lucky, we'll start to get herd immunity or something, or a travel protocol that really, where Hawaii is perceived as a safe destination, and every person that gets off an airplane is tested, tracked, and traced. Okay, so suppose that, put the nerds in charge, and suppose that happens. Then the question becomes, where are we in 2025? Where are we in 2035? Because we're talking about a house now. We're talking about, the average life of a mortgage is 7 years, right? So, and there I think it's important to remember that it wasn't actually looking all that good out in the 2030s, for example. The population growth rate has slowed almost to nil. Population on Oahu's been declining for several years. That's probably mostly military downsizing. But if you think about the economic policy battles, right? We want to dismantle telescopes. Are you serious? We want to get rid of the corn seed industry. Really? No biotech. How's that going to look? We don't want missiles on. Okay, fine. Those political movements are still in place today, and people are still engaged in pursuing it. We want less tourism because less is more. Okay, this is less. I'm just saying all of those things were there, and the aging phenomenon was converging so that in about 2035, you start to see boomers disappear, and they didn't make enough babies, and maybe there's enough houses. So there were lots of reasons. So this is not the arc from 1947 through 19 '69 that sort of made Hawaii. It was actually Oahu. And then what happened in 1970, you guys all remember? Jimi Hendrix played his Rainbow Bridge concert in Pukalani, and all the hippies realized they could go live on Maui. And that's, 1970 was kind of the year that the neighbor islands were discovered. So the neighbor islands have had this half-century arc. What I'm saying is the next half century is not going to look like that. And the next quarter century, it was not going to look like that even before the coronavirus. So curb your enthusiasm. I'm just saying that the path was flattening already. And maybe that means rather than speculators, your market is shifting to people are just going to live in a house.
Paul, I know you got this question in advance about the mortgage bankers, Federal Reserve emergency purchases of bonds.
Yeah.
And what will happen now? Do you want me to read that whole question out, or can you explain it a little bit?
You'd better read it, but
okay, I'll read it.
Yeah.
The mortgage bankers are sounding the alarm that the Federal Reserve's emergency purchases of bonds backed by home loans, are unintentionally putting their industry at risk. The Fed, in an emergency effort to forestall mortgage market dislocation, has been purchasing hundreds of billions of dollars of MBS, causing their price to rise sharply and swiftly. That forced enormous losses on lenders who had sold these securities short as a hedge. The result is chaos in the mortgage banking industry and a shutoff in new origination. That in turn will suppress home purchases in an already weak market. The Fed suddenly reversed course Friday morning to allow mortgage prices to fall sharply as an emergency measure to relieve the mortgage bankers. Question is, what will happen now and how will this impact the residential real estate market?
Yeah, so when I was back in my, I'm a recovering commercial bank economist, but back in the day, my office was in the dealing room, in the trading room at Bank of Hawaii in the Treasury. And every morning we would all sit at the Bloomberg terminals. And, there's a person that was the mortgage portfolio person, and then there's a person that was the affordable housing tax credit person who knew we had a portfolio. There's a currency person. And so this is an event where everything happened so quickly and so sharply that the reverberation. So in the trading room at Bank of Hawaii, I used to call this the Brubaker oscillation, and it has a sound effect. Can you all see? It goes like this. It's overshooting with oscillatory convergence, and it's the Warner Brothers sound effect, boing. And so that's what happened last week. It was a boing moment where the Fed was buying, my notes here are dislocated 30-year market, Fed buying 50 billion per day, massive redemption request for selling of MBS, Fed trying to come into the other side to make the other side of the market, to assure liquidity. And yes, and from that splash, the ripples go out, and a lot of people found themselves on the wrong side of a hedge. The bigger picture, however, is the Fed assuring that a secondary market for mortgage-backed securities, and therefore the originations that go into those securities, can be maintained, that the order can be maintained in that market. And notwithstanding the initial loss, because you built a hedge for something that didn't happen, right? You were on the wrong side of a hedge, and who knew? And sorry to be you, put it into your first quarter earnings and move on. Because what the Fed's doing now is standing ready to buy whatever's there. We're talking about, I think they said something this morning like $2.5 trillion. So everybody knows there's this massive wave of refis that's coming. I think besides the initial shock wave and upheaval, the ultimate goal is to provide liquidity by standing ready to purchase. Now, some of my other notes. Yeah, there's another side of this, of course, which is that in the legislation recently adopted, right, there's all this forbearance, and homeowners under stress can request 180-day forbearance. Renters are getting a break. There's a whole thing that's going to radiate back into the commercial real estate market, right? As what are the REITs going to do when people aren't paying rent for 6 months? In commercial real estate, what's going on there? Is the tenant even going to come back, right? Are you going to reopen that restaurant? And like, if you are, don't you need more seats, more space so that the tables can be farther apart? Or are you going to give up and just go, hook up with Uber and Lyft and completely change your operation? I mean, I don't even understand why there's a hostess, right? I should be able to go on my phone with my little Open Table app, book a table and a seat like I do on an airplane on a particular day and time, make my order on the phone, and then just show up to the socially distanced dining area. I don't need a hostess to make me stand in the front for 15 minutes while that person figures out, right? I mean, I'm just saying, a lot of industries are going to change as a consequence of this, and so that's going to radiate backward into commercial real estate and obviously into residential real estate. The best I can say is I realize it's been disruptive in the initial weeks of this, but ultimately the Fed pre-announcing, right, it's actually put a number out there. We're going to go a couple of trillion. That's on top of the 4 trillion or 4.5 that's already there. A big piece of which is mortgage-backed securities. We stand ready to make the secondary market. And by the way, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, last I checked, are still in conservatorship, right? So they still have the full faith and backing or whatever of the U.S. Treasury for whatever that's worth. So I would say it's going to be rough. My wife's a banker. She's doing small business apps right now, and she's going crazy. So look, everybody's working as hard as they can on making sure the system works. I think the mortgage banking system in general is in pretty good shape to weather the strain. Hawaii did have among the lowest delinquency rates in the country going into this. And so clearly there's going to be stresses put in place. And even worse than that, if you take advantage of this forbearance aspect of the CARES Act, your numbers don't go into the delinquency statistics. So it's going to be difficult to understand how much real delinquency there is, but maybe that's not really delinquency. Anyway, I'm just saying we're all going to be sorting our way through this, and I think the mortgage markets will stabilize. And it's the one area actually that I think the system will continue to work reasonably well. Part of which is that fintech essentially had already taken over.
Okay, there were a couple of questions on forbearance.
Sure.
Yeah.
Ryan, are you cutting us off, or is there time for?
Well, we want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know we've booked 90 minutes for this. There's about 5 minutes left. I say we can do maybe a couple of questions. We will go over, but the questions that you have compiled, we will provide to Paul. And Paul, if we can ask you an enormous favor to take a skim through those and practice your writing skills. So Kehao can make that available to you. Also, this video will be available for you to review sometime next week. And the slides are also available right now if you give us an email at support@higheinfo.com. In any case, just give us, Kim, just give us, let's say 10 more minutes, and then we'll end this with some remarks from Faith, and everything else we will try to follow up later.
Okay.
Okay. Or you want me to ask a couple questions, Paul? Okay.
Go ahead. I'm looking at the chat, but there's like 99 questions, so we're not going to.
So there were a couple of questions grouped around supply chain.
Yeah.
And then also one about construction, construction materials, effect on the construction industry.
Well, yes, and we're seeing supply chain disruption in a number of different areas. I alluded to the construction materials area earlier. And a lot of them, food is another one. You have to understand, at the end of February or in early March, it was still the case half the meals in America were eaten away from home, and the other half were eaten at home. Literally half. So half of the food distribution was set up to direct food to restaurants, and the other half was to supermarkets, and then everybody went home. so it's just been a big disruption on the demand side, and all of these demand side, with toilet paper, with Lysol spray, what you call Clorox cleanup or wipes and all that other stuff, right? These guys are used to production and supply chain models where the consumption is the same every day of the week, all year long. And they have designed their factories to maximize production and utilize an efficient supply chain so that every time you finish a roll of toilet paper, just another one has been produced and the supply chain is in perfect equilibrium. And as soon as the demand jumps the way it did, the supply chain is disrupted, but it's worse than that because a big piece of the supply chain, if not for the actual final products, but for the materials. So for example, in cleaning supplies, the final products are these sprays and wipes and whatnot, but the underlying chemicals are coming from China and East Asia or foreign sources, where those supply chains for the materials, for the inputs, were disrupted back in February. And you see what I mean? So ramping, first of all, the factories were already producing at full tilt, and so it's hard for them to change capacity. We're seeing some of this, right, with the medical equipment, with the respirators, where people aren't going to buy autos, so they're going to try to switch over. But you have these others. So, to bring it back to food as an example, there's going to be a little window of opportunity for people, right? We're in the tropics, it's 70 days, I know, because my dad's a corn guy, from planting to harvest is 70 days. So if you planted corn in February, you will harvest it next month. And, that kind of stuff, we can begin to fill in some of the gaps, right? For a while, the fresh produce was piling up because people had switched to canned goods and were staying at home. And now I think that might be starting to go the other way. So yes, it's going to be disruptive. It was disruptive in the secondary market for mortgages, is disrupted in the food supply chain, is disruptive in building materials for the same. And by the way, some of that disruption had originated with the tariffs. So I knew a guy, Samsung guy, who was the granite countertop guy. And so they put, the tariff came in at about 25% on Chinese granite countertops. And so demand went down, but when demand decreases, right, when the effective price goes up and you slide back along the demand curve, that decrease in the quantity demanded means that the quarry back in China has to descale production. But at a lower production scale, its fixed costs don't change. So the cost per unit actually goes up. So instead of a 25% increase, they had an 80% increase. Do you see what I mean? And so then everybody's switching to other countertops, and that supply chain is affected. So some of this disruption has actually been going on in the background ever since the trade war began, and then accelerated last year, and then bam comes the coronavirus. All I can say is, every time I look at one of these places, it helps to think about whether there's an opportunity. Is there an opportunity to help somebody with a commercial real estate solution to the problem? If it's, warehousing or whatever, are we going to, right? Some people Walmart or Costco, they are warehouses, right? So they're not as affected as a small shop somewhere that relies on being able to put in an order and get something delivered the next day. All I can say is it's having wider ramifications than we thought. The sooner we all wrap our heads around these problems to solve, I think the better off we'll be. And yes, there might be short-term opportunity, but let's remember, opportunity comes and goes, right? And it's a really fluid and dynamic situation right now. So something just happened to my computer, but that's okay. That's about all I can say on that question.
Cal?
Next.
Let's see. I have questions about Airbnbs, vacation rentals. Kind of lumped into that is the fact that a lot of the vacant second homes on some of our luxury markets are now being used. People flew into Hawaii for their to stay
Shelter.
out there, to shelter here. So asking for comments on Airbnb, VRBO, short-term vacation rental market, and how do you think some of those that behavior of people now using their investment right now, do you see that there'd be a sell-off of those or not later?
Well, again, we're talking about a market segment. By the way, vacation renters are 1/4 of the transient accommodation inventory on the neighbor islands, 25%. So, right, it's roughly, 25% vacation rental, 25% timeshare, 25% hotel. I mean, I'm rounding, but 10% on Oahu, 25% on the neighbor islands. So not an insignificant portion of the inventory for which there is zero demand right now. So, unless you really have to, I can't see why you would respond instantaneously. It's like all these people that just sold their entire stock portfolio 2 weeks ago or a week ago at the bottom of the market. If you've gone this far into the ride, you might just wait to get something out of it. But vacation rentals have confronted a very hostile political environment. The mayor on Kauai, who's kind of like, sorry, you guys, Kauai guys. I'm like, Derek, what up, bro? It's like, I heard on the news last night, he's going to make them illegal or something. I'm like, can you do that? And I'm like, curfew, seriously? Really? So I'm just saying, now is not the moment probably to do something precipitous. But if you need a reason for a portfolio allocation because you're looking far enough down the road that you think the world is going to be significantly different, now would also, not be the time to delay a portfolio, thinking about a portfolio reallocation and how you would execute. And given, the sheer magnitude of the inventory on the neighbor islands, in theory, it's possible that this could temporarily have a congenial impact on housing affordability. We'll just have to see. I don't see how Hawaii tourism functions in the future without undocumented vacation rentals. The whole situation on Oahu was ridiculous. They put a ban in place 30 years ago. Then for 30 years they didn't enforce them. They grew the only growth in lodging capacity in Hawaii for 25 years on the neighbor islands and for 30 years on Oahu was vacation rentals. The only growth net. So, I don't see a future where we just deny the benefits of search and matching technology. It's on your phone, like everything else. So I would have thought over time that smartphone apps, apps in general, algorithms would play an increasing role in residential tenancy and tenure of any sort. And by the way, I think that the dichotomy between residents and visitors is completely archaic. It has nothing to do with the world we now inhabit, or we did a month ago, where people were moving around. Now, that may change. They might not move around as much. And as a realtor and working with your investors, I think it's going to be a good time to think that through. Will we, in fact, move around as much as we used to? My impression was that people really liked being able to live that lifestyle. I mean, I was living in Denver if I added up, I was living in Denver about 3 months out of the year because that's where my kids are. You know what I mean? And so this, I don't know, I'm just saying, approach everything now. What the shock of this disruption teaches us is that we should approach everything from the standpoint of what it could look like over the next decade, which, because of the nature of technology, could be completely different. Now, you may not like some of the externalities, the negative external costs associated with intrusion of short-term habitation into more traditional, residential types of communities. But we have thousands of years of human history to observe how people have managed that, and it's a management problem. Prohibition is not management. So again, I would say let's think through to the other end of it. But yeah, I mean, obviously demand is nil. How long can an investor withstand that? The crackdown was already happening on Oahu. By my calculation, on an annualized basis, Oahu was out 350 to 400 million in tourism receipts just from the vacation rental crackdown. So, if you weren't thinking about where this goes, you will be now. And again, it's just me, but I think there's an opportunity to help investors and property owners and managers think creatively through what the future looks like. I don't think it's going away. In fact, for the same reason the hotels converted to timeshare, which was all about risk management, right? If I take each room, turn it into a condo with, right, the individual unit can be owned, strip that condo into 50 weeks, I've securitized my risk exposure. So it was just securitization. And it's like, on Star Trek, right? The Borg collective, resistance is futile, prepare to be assimilated. I mean, if the hotels all were migrating to a timeshare format, and I'm pretty sure that vacation rental, right, the apps were going to change the way we think of habitation generally, not just sort of leisure-oriented travel, even though it's the dominant thing here in Hawaii. Sorry, let's move on. I have no short answers.
Thank you so much. First, thank you to Paul for your time and your insights today. See, I changed my background for you because you said.
Yeah, I know. I made sure my laundry can't be seen, but shoulders are covering it.
Anyway, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. This is the first event, I think, of its kind, maybe ever, or if not, a very long time. And I'd like to thank Kehao and Karen Shaw and Karen Ono and Ryan Ozawa for helping to put this together. We hope that this is the first of many. And, we look forward to bringing you more things virtually, as, that's the way the world is going right now. We'll have I believe the PDF of this presentation is already available, and then the video will be available soon. So please email us at support@higheinfo.com so that we can make sure that we can get the PDF and eventually the video for you. I believe we are going to, as Ryan mentioned, we'll have a press release that we're going to send out. And let's see, I have a list over here. And then most important right now, we're trying to think of ways that we can get some of these other questions answered and, provide some kind of follow-up. Thank you for the engagement and just a very active chat. And thanks to Ryan and Kehao for moderating. And, I thank you for spending, your lunch hour with us. And we look forward to many more of these. So stay safe, everyone, and take care.